And now we're getting more and more upstream when Hiram Moerman from Apeiron will give the lessons learned from the applications with limited downstream use. We're all eager to hear that.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. ECHA, or should I say the Eastern Bunnies, asked me to share our experience on whether there's a limited possibility for information exchange between downstream users and applicants. This can happen in different settings, as I will show in this presentation. If you want a good dossier, in the end, you need good information. This information is needed both for the CSR, the AOA, as the SEA. But there are traps. There are traps in obtaining this information. I'm not talking about the quality of the dossier itself, but about sharing and interpretation of the information provided. And especially this is the case when more stakeholders are involved. Let's look at some cases. The first case is a relatively easy one. It's one company who is applying for 3 different sites. The case is easy in the sense that the sites belong to the same company and have the same interests. The example is actually the example we heard already before by Richard. It's a grow case where the manufacturer of bathroom taps and shower heads uses chromium trioxide to plate the taps. The alternatives of the 3 sites are the same. So what is then exactly the communication issue? Well, the issue arises in the CSR. Although the use is the same, the actual installations are different, and also the use conditions are different. These differences had to be reflected in a dossier to support, as Richard described, the long review period Roja was seeking. So what happened in this dossier? We developed a method to collect the right information from the different sites, and this in a structured way. The structure, based on the working contributing scenarios, allowed us to compare the use conditions and the exposure data. For instance, we developed a standard procedure for exposure monitoring. In the next step, the dossier strategy was defined. Based on our analysis and interpretation of the collected data, we concluded that the sites could be integrated, aggregated into one dossier. In the CSR, the workers' exposure values were reported per site and then aggregated in the SEA. This is different for the environmental exposure, where also in the SEA, the values are monetized per site, and this to reflect the differences in regions where the sites are located. However, if it would have been the case that the exposure data was significantly different between the sites, then we would have split the dossier to avoid that the best-in-class is dragged into a shorter review period. But what if not 1, but 3 different companies are involved, a typically downstream user consortium setup? The situation clearly gets more complex in case a number of different downstream users want to apply together for authorization. The situation looks similar to the previous one, but now the different sites belong to different companies. So what's typically here? First of all, the companies have different business models, which influences the SEA. For instance, the non-use scenarios for the different companies might be different. Secondly, competition law limits data sharing between competitors. For instance, it's very sensitive for competitors to share future intentions and information on alternatives. So how can this be supported? Of course, the first thing we did was, as in the previous case, we facilitated the communication flow. Secondly, as trustee, we identified the limits of information sharing, what can be shared and what cannot. Companies may already be working together in associations. Information shared there can also be used. On the other hand, alternatives developed by an individual company might be more difficult to share. Finally, we found common grounds for the business models to be built in the SEA. Based on all this, we defined this dossier strategy, what can be developed jointly and what can be submitted individually. In this specific case, There is a shared best practice for exposure reduction and a joint effort on alternatives. This allowed us to make and submit a joint dossier. These were more or less the easy ones. Let's have a look at a little bit more complex situations. A different situation occurs when a supplier applies for an authorization of use of his customer. In this case, both companies choose this setup. They do not have to, because both could, in principle, also apply individually. But if they do, they do need to work together and communicate in order to complete the dossier. What are the challenges here? Of course, the downstream user needs to communicate in an efficient way the details on exposure and use conditions. We facilitated this again with our structured communication method. For alternatives, on the other hand, the downstream user may be developing alternatives he cannot share with the supplier. In this case, it was actually the case. The third issue is a confidential business information. In the SEA, details on profit, revenues, or future sales volumes are often required, and is both from the applicant as the downstream user. These numbers companies often do not want to share. Also, for this dossier, we were both trustee and dossier author. So how did we resolve this? For this case, it was key to identify the minimal but sufficient information which the downstream user had to deliver for the argumentation in the dossier. Starting from this requirement, we translated the data requirements for the dossier into specific questions for the downstream user, and we supported the downstream user replying these questions while protecting his CBI concerns. As already mentioned before in the previous presentation, transparency is key. Transparency of both stakeholders towards the trustee is absolutely needed. Only starting from the full story, it is possible to know what information is minimal and sufficient. It's similar to a lawyer. We cannot write a dossier if we don't know the full story. The last example I want to share with you is a little more complex and a little awkward. I called it a make-to-order situation. What's the specific here? An Annex 14 substance is used by a company to produce a product for a customer. This customer depends heavily on the availability of this product for his business. As a result, the customer takes the initiative to apply for authorization. However, because he is not the user of the Annex 14 substance, he cannot apply himself. He has to collaborate with his supplier. For the CSR, there is little concern, as the downstream user is the applicant and has access to all required data. Footnote: because the customer needs a long review period and thus the best possible dossier, this customer drives the applicant towards the best, read lowest possible exposure, which gives a new dynamic into the dossier building. However, the real challenge lies more with analysis of alternatives and the SEA. Although in this case the customer originally transferred the technology to the applicant himself developed the technology further. As a result, the applicant and the customer both contribute to the AOA with confidential information. The applicant more on the alternative side of the process, the customer more on the product side. Because the customer took the initiative for the application, it is also the customer's business case that influences the SEA the most. The approach we took here is similar to the previous one. As trustee, we developed the structured communication between the two parties to collect the data, while at the same time helping the parties to reply to the questions while protecting their CBI. This in a context where there is no other option than to share the data. Compared to the previous case, it was clear that more confidential information from the customer had to be filtered to protect his confidentiality, while still building a strong case for the requested 20-year review period. These were 4 examples we encounter frequently of settings where there are limitations in communication between the downstream user and the applicant. although the structure of the solution is always the same, each time the solution is tailor-made for each individual dossier. Thank you.